My parents mistreated me in childhood, my father beat me, and my mother said I was a mistake of nature. But when the neighbor adopted me, and I finally started to live normally, they sued me. Hi Reddit. I don't usually share personal stuff like this, but after everything I've been through, I guess it's time to get it off my chest. This story isn't easy to tell, but maybe putting it out there will help me finally move on. I've never posted anything on here before, so bear with me. This is the story of how I finally escaped the hell that was my life at home, with a little help from someone who saw me for who I really am. I guess I should start by introducing myself. My name is Alex. I'm 17 now, but this all started when I was about 14. It's weird to look back and think about how much time has passed, how much has changed, and how much hasn't. I grew up in what most people would consider a typical suburban family, but behind closed doors, it was anything but. My parents, Diane and Mark, weren't the loving, supportive type you'd expect. They were the kind of parents who made it clear that I was a disappointment from day one. In school, I was pretty average. I didn't get straight A's, but I wasn't failing either. I wasn't particularly athletic, though I tried out for a few teams just to feel like I belonged somewhere. But no matter what I did, it was never good enough for Diane and Mark. At home, they'd tell me I was lazy, that I'd never amount to anything. They'd say I was an embarrassment, that they regretted having me. It wasn't just harsh words. They made sure to remind me every day how worthless they thought I was. I remember one time in particular. I must have been about 15. I had worked really hard on this history project. I even stayed up all night finishing it. When I brought it home, hoping to show it off, my dad barely looked at it. He just glanced at the grade, B pi, and said, "Why wasn't it an A?" Then he walked away. My mom just shook her head and muttered something about how I was wasting my potential. After a while, I stopped trying to show them anything. School wasn't much of an escape either. Diane and Mark had this weird obsession with being overly involved, but not in a good way. They'd come to every parent-teacher conference, every school event, not to support me, but to criticize. They'd tell my teachers that I was lazy, that I didn't try hard enough, that I was disrespectful at home. It was humiliating. I'd see the looks on my teachers' faces, half pity, half disbelief, but there wasn't much they could do. I think they wanted to help, but how do you tell a parent to stop bullying their own kid? There was one teacher, though, who really made a difference. Mrs. Collins, my English teacher. She saw right through the act Diane and Mark put on. She knew something was wrong, but she never pushed. Instead, she'd give me extra time on assignments, or let me sit in her classroom during lunch when I didn't want to face the cafeteria. She'd leave notes on my papers, not just about the work, but little things like, "You did great on this part," or, "I can tell you really put a lot of thought into this." It wasn't much, but those little notes were like lifelines. They made me feel like someone actually saw me. But as much as Mrs. Collins tried to help, it wasn't enough. I dreaded going home every day. The car ride back with Diane and Mark was always tense, filled with their complaints about the traffic, the weather, the state of the world. Anything but me. I guess I was lucky in that sense. The silence was better than the constant criticism. But the moment we walked through the front door, it was like a switch flipped. My mom would start nitpicking everything I did, from the way I dropped my bag by the door to how I didn't smile enough when I greeted her. My dad would find reasons to yell at me, usually something trivial, like not hanging my jacket properly or leaving a light on. It didn't take much to set him off. The worst part was, it wasn't just emotional abuse. There were times when my dad would get physical. It started small, shoves, slaps. But as I got older, it escalated. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to avoid making eye contact, to stay out of his way. But no matter how careful I was, it never seemed to matter. He'd find something to blame me for, some reason to take out his anger on me. And my mom? She'd just stand there and watch, sometimes even joining in with her own verbal jabs. It was like they fed off each other's cruelty. After a while, I started spending as much time as I could away from home. I'd stay late at school, claiming I had extra work to do, or I'd hang out at the library until it closed. Sometimes I'd just wander around the neighborhood, trying to delay the inevitable. It was on one of these walks that I met Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins lived a few houses down from us, an older lady who always had a kind word for everyone. She had a small garden in her front yard, filled with flowers of all kinds, and she'd often be out there tending to them. I didn't know her well, but she always smiled and waved when I passed by. One day, when I was particularly down, she called out to me and asked if I wanted to help her with the garden. I was hesitant at first, but something in her voice made me say yes. That day changed everything. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. She had this warmth about her, this genuine kindness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. She didn't ask a lot of questions, just handed me a pair of gardening gloves and started showing me what to do. We didn't talk much that first day, but it was the first time in as long as I could remember that I felt at peace. There was something soothing about working with my hands, digging in the dirt, and seeing the flowers bloom under our care. As the weeks went by, I found myself spending more and more time at Mrs. Jenkins' house. She never pushed me to talk, but over time, I started opening up to her. I told her about school, about my teachers, and eventually, about Diane and Mark. She listened without judgment, just nodding and offering the occasional piece of advice. It felt strange at first, talking about my life to someone who wasn't a teacher or a counselor, but Mrs. Jenkins had this way of making you feel safe, like you could tell her anything and she'd still see you the same way. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the line, Mrs. Jenkins became more than just a neighbor. She became the person I turned to when things got bad at home, the one place where I knew I could go to escape, even if it was just for a little while. She'd let me stay for dinner sometimes, even though I knew I'd get hell for it when I got home. It was worth it, though, just to have a few hours of normalcy, of kindness. It wasn't long before Diane and Mark started noticing how much time I was spending at Mrs. Jenkins's house. At first, they didn't say much, probably glad to have me out of the house, but eventually, they started making snide comments. They'd ask why I was always over there, what I was doing, why I didn't just stay home. My dad accused me of trying to get out of my chores, of being lazy, of trying to manipulate Mrs. Jenkins into feeling sorry for me. My mom would say I was being disrespectful, that I was embarrassing them by spending so much time with that old woman. It didn't matter what they said, though. I kept going back. The next couple of years were a blur of school, Mrs. Jenkins' garden, and the increasingly hostile environment at home. Diane and Mark's bullying got worse, and their anger seemed to grow with each passing day. They'd find new ways to punish me, new things to criticize. My grades started slipping, not because I didn't care, but because I was so exhausted from the constant stress. I barely slept, my appetite was gone, and I felt like I was walking around in a daze most of the time. Mrs. Collins noticed the change in me, but there was only so much she could do. She pulled me aside one day after class and asked if everything was okay. I wanted to tell her the truth, to let her know how bad things had gotten, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too scared of what Diane and Mark would do if they found out I'd told someone. So I just nodded and said I was fine, even though I knew she didn't believe me. Things finally came to a head one night when I was 16. I had just gotten home from Mrs. Jenkins's house, and my parents were waiting for me in the living room. The moment I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. My dad was pacing back and forth, his face red with anger, and my mom was sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, glaring at me. Before I could say anything, my dad grabbed me by the arm and yanked me into the room. They started screaming at me, accusing me of all sorts of things, lying, stealing, disrespecting them, you name it. My mom said I was a disgrace, that I was tearing the family apart, that I was turning into a troublemaker. My dad, of course, took it a step further. He said I was a failure, that I'd never amount to anything, that I was a burden they never wanted. And then, he hit me. Harder than he ever had before. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out or something, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in front of Mrs. Jenkins's house. I don't even remember running there, but there I was, pounding on her door in the middle of the night, tears streaming down my face. When she opened the door and saw me, her face went pale. She didn't say a word, just pulled me inside and wrapped her arms around me. I broke down completely then, sobbing into her shoulder, unable to stop. She just held me, rocking me back and forth like a child, whispering that everything was going to be okay. I didn't go home that night. I stayed with Mrs. Jenkins, and she let me sleep on her couch. The next morning she sat me down at the kitchen table and handed me a cup of tea. "You can stay here as long as you need to," she said, her voice soft but firm. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to go back home, to try and fix things, but another part of me knew there was nothing left to fix. My parents didn't want me. They never had, and I couldn't keep pretending that they did. So I stayed. It wasn't easy. Diane and Mark came by the house a few times, demanding that I come home, but Mrs. Jenkins refused to let them in. She told them that if they wanted me back, they'd have to prove they were willing to change, to treat me with the respect and care that I deserved. Of course they didn't. They just kept shouting, threatening to call the police to report Mrs. Jenkins for kidnapping. But she stood her ground, and eventually, they gave up. Mrs. Jenkins became my legal guardian not long after that. She hired a lawyer, went to court, and did everything by the book. I didn't have to go back to Diane and Mark's house, not even to pack my things. Mrs. Jenkins took care of it all, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was worth something, like someone actually cared about me. School got better after that. With Mrs. Jenkins' support, I was able to focus again, and my grades started to improve. I still had to deal with the occasional nasty comment from Diane and Mark. They never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was a traitor, or that I'd abandoned them, but I didn't let it get to me. I had Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Jenkins in my corner, and that was more than enough. Hey Reddit, it's Alex again. A lot of you read my first post, and I'm still blown away by the support and messages I received. I didn't expect so many people to connect with my story, and I want to thank you all for that. I promised there was more to tell, and today, I'm diving into the next chapter of my life. It's a wild one, filled with twists and turns, and it's all about how a simple idea we came up with in high school ended up changing our lives forever. After Mrs. Jenkins adopted me, things finally started to look up. I was free from Diane and Mark's toxic grip, and I could finally breathe. But just because I was out of their house didn't mean the scars they left on me were gone. I was still that kid who felt like he didn't belong, the one who was always on the outside looking in. But everything changed when I met my crew. 4 friends who would become more like brothers over the years. It was sophomore year when I first met them. School was still tough for me, not academically, but socially. I wasn't exactly popular, and I had a hard time trusting people after everything that had happened. But there was this group of guys who always seemed to have each other's backs, and I envied that. There was Josh, the brainiac who could solve any problem you threw at him. Danny, the charismatic guy who could talk his way out of anything. Mike, the tech wizard who knew everything about computers. And Eric, the quiet one who was always observing, always planning. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but one day, Josh asked me if I wanted to join them for lunch. I was hesitant at first. Why would they want to hang out with me? But something in Josh's easy smile and the way the others seemed genuinely interested made me say yes. That lunch turned into a regular thing, and before I knew it, I was part of their group. Hanging out with them was like nothing I'd ever experienced. They weren't like the other kids who were obsessed with popularity or who made fun of anyone who didn't fit in. They were different, smart, ambitious, and most importantly, they accepted me for who I was. We spent hours talking about everything: school, our messed up families, our dreams for the future. And eventually, we started talking about something that would change our lives: cheating. Now, before you judge, let me explain. It wasn't about being lazy or not wanting to work hard. We were all good students, but the pressure to be perfect was insane. The school we went to was one of those high-achieving places where everyone was expected to get straight A's, join a dozen clubs, and still have time to volunteer on the weekends. It was impossible to keep up, and we all felt it. It was Josh who first brought up the idea. We were sitting in his basement, surrounded by textbooks and notes, trying to cram for a big history test. He looked up from his notes and said, "What if we didn't have to stress about this so much? What if we could just, guarantee we'd get the right answers?" At first, we all laughed it off. Cheating? That was something other kids did, not us. But Josh wasn't joking. He had this look in his eye, the one he always got when he was on the brink of solving a problem. "I'm serious," he said. "What if we could come up with a system, something foolproof?" We were intrigued and a little nervous, but Josh was persuasive, and before long, we were all in. Over the next few days, we brainstormed, trying to figure out the best way to cheat without getting caught. Mike suggested using our phones, but we all knew that was too risky. Teachers were always watching for that. Then Danny, who had this knack for thinking outside the box, came up with the idea that would set everything in motion. "Why don't we use our clothes?" he said one day, tossing a pencil into the air. "I mean, teachers aren't going to strip search us, right?" It was so simple, but it made perfect sense. We started experimenting with different ways to hide answers on our clothes. Tiny printouts sewn into our sleeves, answers written on the inside of our shoes, even special pockets in our backpacks where we could stash cheat sheets. Mike, always the tech genius, suggested using invisible ink pens that would only show up under a special light. He rigged up these tiny UV flashlights that we could attach to our belts, and suddenly, we had a system that was practically undetectable. The first time we tried it, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. We were all sitting in history class, about to take this massive test on World War II. I had the answers to the most challenging questions hidden in my sleeve, and I could barely concentrate. But then, I saw Josh across the room. He gave me a slight nod, and that's all it took. I took a deep breath, pulled up my sleeve just enough to see the answers, and started writing. We all aced that test. Not just passed, aced. The rush we felt afterward was like nothing else. It wasn't just about the grades, though that was part of it. It was the fact that we'd outsmarted the system, that we'd found a way to beat the pressure and come out on top. And the best part? We didn't get caught. After that, we started using the system regularly. Not for every test, but for the ones that mattered most. The finals, the AP exams, the ones that could make or break your GPA. We got so good at it that we started sharing the method with a few other friends, and before long, we had a small network of students who were all using our techniques. But it wasn't until senior year that things really took off. By then, we'd refined our methods even more. Mike had developed a way to hide tiny earpieces in our ears that connected to our phones, allowing us to share answers in real time without anyone noticing. We could ace any test, any quiz, without breaking a sweat. And then Danny, always the entrepreneur, had another idea. Why not sell the answers? It started small. We'd charge a few bucks here and there to help people out. Nothing too serious. But word spread fast. Soon we had kids from other schools reaching out to us, desperate for help on their exams. That's when we realized we were sitting on a gold mine. We started charging more. $20 for a quiz, $50 for a test, and $100 for final exams. It was easy money, and we were raking it in. By the time we graduated, we'd made thousands of dollars. It was crazy. We didn't stop there, though. The four of us were all smart, and we knew that the real money wasn't in high school. It was in college. We all got accepted to the same university, a big state school with tens of thousands of students. It was the perfect place to expand our business. College was a whole different game. The stakes were higher, the classes were harder, and the professors were a lot more vigilant. But we were up for the challenge. We adapted our methods, coming up with new ways to cheat that were even more sophisticated than what we'd done in high school. Mike developed an app that looked like a calculator, but was actually a way to store and retrieve answers. Eric, who had always been the quiet planner, started hacking into professors' computers to get access to exam questions before they were even handed out. Our business grew faster than we could have imagined. We started hiring other students to help us, spies who would gather information, runners who would deliver cheat sheets, even tutors who would help craft the perfect fake study materials to throw professors off the scent. We were making more money than we knew what to do with. But with success came risk. We knew we were walking a fine line, and it was only a matter of time before someone tried to take us down. It happened during our junior year. One of our runners got caught delivering a cheat sheet to a frat house, and the administration launched an investigation. We were terrified. If they traced it back to us, we were done for. But Danny, always the smooth talker, managed to spin it in our favor. He convinced the runner to take the fall, promising him a big payout if he kept his mouth shut. The kid did, and we paid him off, but it was a close call. After that, we tightened our operation even more. No one knew who we were, not even most of the students who used our services. We became ghosts, operating in the shadows, always one step ahead of the administration. By the time we graduated, we had made a small fortune. We had connections all over campus, and our network of spies and runners was more extensive than ever. But we knew that college wasn't the end game. We had bigger plans that would take us beyond the university and into the real world. After graduation, the four of us sat down and had a serious talk about the future. We knew we couldn't keep running the same operation forever. Eventually, we'd get caught, or someone would turn on us. But we didn't want to give up the money or the thrill of outsmarting the system. That's when Josh, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, dropped a bombshell. "Why don't we go legit?" he said, looking around the table. We all stared at him, confused. I mean, think about it. We've got the skills, the connections. Why not start a business? We could use what we've learned, but do it in a way that's, legal. At first, we didn't take him seriously. How could we turn cheating into a legitimate business? But the more we talked about it, the more it started to make sense. We realized that what we were really good at wasn't just cheating. It was problem solving. We knew how to find loopholes, how to think outside the box, how to outsmart people who were supposed to be smarter than us. And those were skills that could be valuable in the business world. So we took the plunge. We pooled our money and started a consulting firm. Our pitch was simple. We helped businesses find solutions to problems they didn't even know they had. Whether it was streamlining operations, finding tax loopholes, or developing new strategies for growth. We were the guys who could get it done. And we were good at it. Really good. In just a few years, our firm grew from a small startup to a multi-million-dollar business. We hired more people, expanded our services, and started working with some of the biggest companies in the country. It was surreal. We went from being broke college kids running a cheating ring to being successful entrepreneurs with a legitimate business. But of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were plenty of bumps along the way. Legal battles, shady competitors, clients who tried to screw us over. And there were moments when we had to make tough decisions. Decisions that sometimes pushed the boundaries of what was legal or ethical. But we always found a way through, just like we had in high school and college. There was one incident that still stands out, something that almost brought everything crashing down. It was during a huge deal with a major tech company. We had been hired to help them find a way to reduce their tax liability, and we came up with a brilliant strategy that saved them millions. But just as the deal was about to close, we found out that one of our employees, a guy we'd hired from a rival firm, had been leaking our plans to a competitor. It was a disaster. If the leak got out, not only would we lose the deal, but we could face legal action for breach of contract. We had to act fast. Josh, Danny, Mike, and I stayed up all night, trying to figure out how to contain the situation. In the end, Eric, who had always been the quiet one, came up with a plan. He hacked into the competitor's system, erased the leaked files, and planted fake documents that led them on a wild goose chase. It was risky, and if we'd been caught, it could have ruined us. But it worked. The deal went through, the competitor was left empty-handed, and we walked away with a massive payday. After that, we knew we had to be more careful. We tightened our security, vetted our employees more thoroughly, and made sure that nothing like that could ever happen again. But it was a wake-up call, a reminder that even though we'd gone legit, we were still playing a dangerous game. Today, our firm is one of the most respected in the industry. We've come a long way from those days in high school, hiding answers in our sleeves and hacking into professors' computers. But in a weird way, I think those experiences shaped us, made us who we are. We learned how to think creatively, how to solve problems under pressure, how to outsmart the competition. And those are skills that have served us well in the business world. Hey Reddit, it's Alex again. I'm back with what I think will be the final part of my story. The last few posts were about how I survived a nightmare childhood, found a group of friends who became family, and eventually turned our high school antics into a successful business. But this part, well, it's about confronting the demons of my past once and for all. If you've been following along, you know how tough it's been. But what happened next was beyond anything I could have imagined. Life was going great. The business was booming, and I finally felt like I was in control of my own destiny. Mrs. Jenkins, who had become more of a mother to me than Diane ever was, continued to be my rock. My friends, Josh, Danny, Mike, and Eric, were more like brothers at this point. Together, we were unstoppable. But just when I thought the past was behind me, it came roaring back in the most unexpected and terrifying way. It all started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was at the office, going over some contracts with Mike when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Jenkins, and I could tell right away that something was wrong. She didn't say much, just that I needed to come home immediately. My heart started racing. Mrs. Jenkins was the kind of person who could handle anything with grace, so for her to sound shaken meant something serious was going on. I rushed home, and as soon as I walked through the door, I knew I was in for a confrontation. Sitting on the couch were Diane and Mark, my birth parents. I hadn't seen them in years, and they looked worse than ever. Diane's once neat hair was a mess, and Mark's face was flushed, a telltale sign that he'd been drinking. The stench of alcohol hit me like a wall, and I instinctively stepped back, memories of their abuse flooding my mind. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Diane gave me a sickly, sweet smile, the kind that used to make my skin crawl. "Alex, darling, we've missed you so much," she said, her voice dripping with fake affection. "We've been hearing about your success, your business. We're so proud of you." Mark, on the other hand, didn't bother with pleasantries. He leaned forward, glaring at me with bloodshot eyes. "You owe us, boy," he slurred. "Half of everything. We're your parents, after all." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd done to me, they had the nerve to show up here and demand money? I could feel my hands shaking, but I wasn't going to let them see me sweat. "Get out," I said, my voice cold. "I don't owe you anything. You gave up the right to call yourselves my parents the day you decided I was nothing but a punching bag," but they weren't going to leave quietly. Diane's smile faltered, and she turned to Mark, her eyes narrowing. We brought you into this world, Alex. We raised you. You wouldn't be where you are today without us. We deserve our share." I laughed bitterly. "Raised me? You tortured me. You treated me like garbage. You think that entitles you to anything?" That's when Mark snapped. He shot up from the couch, grabbing an empty beer bottle from the coffee table. Before I could react, he swung it at me, aiming for my head. The bottle smashed against the side of my face, the glass shattering and cutting into my skin. I stumbled back, clutching my cheek, feeling the warm blood start to trickle down. Mrs. Jenkins screamed, and everything after that was a blur. I heard her shouting for help, heard the front door slam open as she ran outside to call the police. Mark was still coming at me, wild with rage, the broken bottle now a jagged weapon in his hand. I managed to block his next swing, the glass cutting into my arm instead of my face, but I knew I couldn't keep this up. Diane was screaming at him to stop, but her words were slurred, and I could tell she was just as drunk as he was. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The front door burst open again, and 2 police officers rushed in. They tackled Mark to the ground, wresting the bottle from his hand and pinning him down. Diane, who had been shrieking at them to leave Mark alone, was quickly restrained as well. It all happened so fast that I barely had time to process it. One minute I was fighting for my life, and the next, they were being dragged out in handcuffs. I sat down heavily on the couch, my head spinning. Mrs. Jenkins was at my side in an instant, pressing a towel to my cheek, her hands trembling. "It's okay, Alex," she whispered. "It's over now. You're safe." But I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was 14 again, trapped in that house with 2 people who were supposed to love me, but only knew how to hurt me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the world for bringing them back into my life. But instead, I just sat there, staring at the blood on my hands, feeling like I was drowning in memories I'd tried so hard to forget. The next few days were a whirlwind of police reports, hospital visits, and legal meetings. Mark and Diane were charged with assault and breaking and entering, and for a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But then I got a letter from their lawyer. Mark and Diane were suing me. They claimed that I had attacked them, that I had stolen money from them, and they were demanding half of my business as compensation. It was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard, but I knew I couldn't take it lightly. If they won, they could destroy everything I'd built. And knowing how cunning Diane could be when she wanted something, I wasn't about to underestimate them. I immediately called Josh, Danny, Mike, and Eric. They were at my place within the hour, and we sat down to figure out how to handle this. We knew the lawsuit was baseless, but we also knew that it could drag on for months, maybe even years. The stress could hurt our business, not to mention the cost of legal fees. We needed a plan, and we needed one fast. Josh, always the strategist, suggested that we go on the offensive. "We know what kind of people they are," he said, pacing the room. "They're desperate, they're manipulative, and they're willing to do anything for money. We need to use that against them." "What do you have in mind?" I asked, still feeling the sting of the bandages on my cheek. "We dig up everything we can on them," Josh replied. "Their financial records, their criminal history, everything. We find out what they've been up to all these years, and we use it to bury them in court." Mike nodded in agreement. "I can hack into their accounts, find out where they've been spending their money, who they've been talking to. We can build a case that shows they're just after your money and nothing more. And I'll reach out to my contacts," Danny added. "I know some people in the legal world who owe me a favor or two. We'll get the best lawyer money can buy, someone who'll make sure this case doesn't even make it to trial." Eric, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "We should also go after their parental rights," he said. "They never should have been allowed to keep custody of you, Alex. We can argue that they're unfit parents and have their rights terminated. It won't change the past, but it'll make sure they can never try to hurt you or anyone else ever again." It was an ambitious plan, but it was exactly what we needed. With Mrs. Jenkins's help, we hired a top-notch lawyer named Mr. Reynolds, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for winning impossible cases. He was exactly the kind of guy we needed on our side. While Mr. Reynolds got to work on the legal front, Mike started digging into Diane and Mark's lives. What he found was both shocking and sickening. They had been living off welfare for years, spending most of their money on alcohol and gambling. They had a long history of domestic violence, and there were even rumors that they had been involved in some shady dealings with local criminals. It was clear that they were in deep trouble, and they saw me as their ticket out. We gathered all the evidence and presented it to Mr. Reynolds, who was more than happy to use it to dismantle their case. But we didn't stop there. We also filed a countersuit, accusing them of attempted extortion, fraud, and defamation. We knew it was a risky move, but we were confident that we had enough dirt on them to make it stick. The court case was brutal. Mark and Diane's lawyer tried every trick in the book, painting me as an ungrateful son who had turned his back on his loving parents. They claimed that I had fabricated the abuse, that Mrs. Jenkins had brainwashed me into hating them, and that I was now trying to ruin their lives out of spite. It was infuriating to listen to, but I knew I had to keep my cool. Our turn came, and Mr. Reynolds tore their arguments apart piece by piece. He presented the evidence Mike had uncovered, showing that Mark and Diane were habitual liars with a long history of violence and financial irresponsibility. He called witnesses who testified to the abuse I had suffered, including Mrs. Jenkins and even a few of my old teachers. By the time he was done, there was no doubt in anyone's mind who the real villains were. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Diane herself. During the cross-examination, Mr. Reynolds asked her about the incident at my house, the one where Mark had attacked me with the bottle. She tried to deny it at first, but Mr. Reynolds was relentless. He pointed out the inconsistencies in her story, the contradictions in her testimony, and finally, in a moment of frustration, she slipped up. She admitted that Mark had been drunk, that he had attacked me in a fit of rage, and that she had been too scared to stop him. The courtroom went silent. Diane realized what she had done, but it was too late. The damage was done, and their case was dead in the water. The judge ruled in our favor, dismissing their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile it. But that wasn't the end of it. Thanks to Eric's suggestion, we had also filed to have their parental rights terminated, arguing that they were unfit to be parents. The judge agreed, and Mark and Diane were stripped of all legal rights to me. They could never claim to be my parents again. But we didn't stop there. Using the evidence we had gathered, we also pressed charges against them for assault, attempted extortion, and fraud. With their criminal history and the severity of the charges, the judge had no choice but to sentence them to 25 years in prison. It was over. Finally, after all these years, I was free from them. And not just free, I had won. I had beaten them at their own game, with the help of the people who truly cared about me. With Mark and Diane out of the picture, we turned our attention to their assets, or what little was left of them. We discovered that they had a house, a small one in a rundown part of town, and a few other minor assets. It wasn't much, but it was something. We seized their assets as part of the settlement, and while it wasn't a huge windfall, it felt like poetic justice. We decided to rent out the house. It wasn't worth much, but it brought in a steady stream of income, which we reinvested into our business. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the dust settled, I started to rebuild my life. The trauma of my past was still there, but I was no longer haunted by it. I had won, and that gave me a sense of closure I never thought I'd have. I also realized that I didn't have to do it alone. I had my friends, my new family, and Mrs. Jenkins, who had been there for me through it all. Around this time, something unexpected happened. I met someone. Her name was Emily, and she was everything I never knew I needed. We met at a charity event that Mrs. Jenkins had dragged me to, and we hit it off immediately. She was smart, funny, and kind, with a sharp wit and a smile that could light up a room. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had found someone who truly understood me. Emily knew about my past, but she never judged me for it. Instead, she supported me, encouraged me to keep moving forward, and helped me see that I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. She became my partner in every sense of the word, and as our relationship grew, so did our plans for the future. A year after we started dating, I proposed to her. It wasn't a grand gesture, just the two of us on a quiet beach at sunset. But it was perfect. She said yes, and we were married a few months later in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family. Mrs. Jenkins walked me down the aisle, and I could see the pride in her eyes as I started this new chapter of my life. Marriage brought with it a sense of peace I hadn't known before. Emily and I moved into a new house, one we had bought together, and we started talking about starting a family of our own. For the first time, I felt like I had truly left the past behind. I was no longer that scared, broken kid. I was a husband, a business owner, and a man who had fought through hell and come out the other side stronger. But even as I moved forward, I never forgot where I came from. I continued to work with my friends, growing our business and using our success to help others. We started a scholarship fund for kids from abusive homes, giving them the chance to escape and build a better life, just like I had. It was our way of giving back, of making sure that no one else had to go through what I did. Life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but I faced them with the confidence that I could handle anything. I had the love of my life by my side, the support of my friends and family, and the knowledge that I had overcome the worst. I was finally free, finally at peace. So, that's the end of my story, Reddit. It's been a long, hard journey, but I wouldn't change a thing. Everything I went through made me who I am today, and for that, I'm grateful. I hope that by sharing this, I can inspire others to keep fighting, to never give up, and to know that no matter how dark things may seem, there's always a way out. Thank you for listening, for your support, and for being a part of this journey with me. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. And I know that with the people I love by my side, I can face anything.